All right, John, important conversation. In today's episode, we had on two really excellent guests and two sponsors of the show. First up, we got Dr. Matthew Lee. At the time of the recording, Matt was the director of empirical research at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, still intimately connected, but Matt's also moving on to take on a full professorship at Baylor University. So Matt's research explores topics like well-being and flourishing, organizational compassion, integration of social science humanities, variety of areas of expertise in Matt's domain. He's a lead editor of Measuring Well-being, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, which was published this past year by Oxford University Press. He's just an all-around great guy and big supporter of the show. So great to chat with him. And then you're going to introduce us to David Johnson.
Yeah, so our second guest today was Dr. David Johnson. He's reader in comparative and international education at the University of Oxford, where he's also a fellow of St. Antony's College. And at the time of this recording, he was also the University of Oxford's junior proctor. He currently directs a research project sponsored by the Templeton World Charity Foundation on education, purpose, and human flourishing in uncertain times. And he's done a lot of work, a lot of research worldwide on human flourishing in many nations, including Sudan, Nigeria, Rwanda, Bhutan, Sierra Leone, and various other nations too. And I mean, that connects with kind of the theme of this discussion that I found most fascinating of many, which is both David's and Matt's work worldwide on various global flourishing studies, in David's various case studies, and the work that Matt outlined that the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard are doing in collaboration with Baylor University on what's called the Global Flourishing Study. Love to talk about that. Nick, what did you really enjoy talking about today?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just thinking about how different cultures, different parts of the world might view flourishing and what that means and what that requires and those sorts of things was certainly the highlight for me. But just talking to these two guys in general, like both brilliant, both lots of knowledge and just easy to talk to. So I think the listeners are really going to enjoy. Here it is, our conversation with Matt Lee and David Johnson. You have a very lovely, what I would describe as Oxford-like background.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's actually real. A lot of my colleagues fake it. But,
authentic. I love it.
I'm actually doing quite an intensive work role. It's an office that dates back to 1248, probably the oldest office in Oxford, and it's that of University Proctor. So I've just got masses of casework. It's, appeals on examinations, discipline, welfare. And then, of course, there's a ceremonial part to the role, which is all the graduation ceremonies. I'm delighted to have capped Hillary Clinton the other day for an honorary doctorate.
How cool.
So it's dressing up in fineries and robes and enjoying the best that Oxford colleges can offer in terms of port and dining. So it's only for a year, sadly. Then I have to, go back to obscurity, relative obscurity, my college, and deal with vexing questions like human flourishing. I
was just going to ask if this current post as proctor has you more or less flourishing.
Well, I'm flourishing in a different direction, which is really good.
David, it's great to meet you. We've sort of been in the same orbit, but I don't think on the same event before. So it's great to connect, and Nick and John, always great to reconnect, and happy to talk about flourishing as always. Flourishing must include rest.
Yes.
And restoration. And we often think of flourishing as like achieving and pushing forward.
Yeah,
but, we really do need to just pause and be instead of do. So
homeostasis. Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's pause for 1 second, and that seamlessly moves into our first question. So I think here we could start this discussion and this conversation. And the first question we'd love to ask each of you is the kind of, I suppose, the golden question in a way of human flourishing, or one of the two golden questions of human flourishing, the other one being how we can flourish. But the prior question to that is, how do each of you define human flourishing. So, Matt, you were just talking then about rest being important for human flourishing. Building on from that, how do you find human flourishing?
Well, the ordinary use of the word would conjure up synonyms like grow, thrive, prosper. And, there's something about activity that is important for us to grow and expand and thrive, but we also need rest. And so it's important to think about bringing ourselves into balance and then in larger harmony with the world. So a nice short definition that we use at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard is complete well-being. We don't just desire happiness or a few of the domains of well-being, but we would like to do or be well in the domains of life that really matter. These domains are ends in themselves, not just means to other ends. So money doesn't buy happiness, and money is not the most important aspect of a flourishing life. But we do think about ends as including happiness and purpose, healthy relationships, virtue, and many other things. So we can think about flourishing at the individual, community, or even ecological level. So individuals can flourish, but if we flourish at the expense of the natural environment, that's, short-term gain, long-term loss. So we need to think about flourishing over the life course and across generations. Are we really flourishing if our own well-being comes at the expense of other people? It doesn't seem quite right, and raises the issue of how responsibility connects to flourishing. And this is where we start thinking about flourishing as something different than well-being. We can be psychologically well, even if our footprint on the world is quite harmful. And so flourishing suggests more of a connection to others and to the natural environment. And so flourishing and justice are not separate. And that's really been an area of fruitful conversation about how flourishing goes beyond well-being, and maybe even connecting with the ultimate ends of life, getting into religion and spirituality. So we like to think of flourishing as multidimensional and intersystemic, involving multiple systems. It unfolds across the life course in ways that often require us to make trade-offs. So we desire to be or do well across these domains. But as any parent knows, if you're up in the middle of the night caring for an infant, your physical and perhaps even emotional well-being might suffer, but your sense of meaning and purpose and your ability to grow a deeper bond with your child might be enhanced. So at different points in our life, we might have to make trade-offs. As we get older, we experience physical health issues with more frequency, sometimes co-occurring conditions, but we can still flourish despite not doing quite as well on one or more of the domains. So there's a lot more that I could say about this, but I would just end with a brief note that suffering and flourishing sometimes are seen as opposites, and sometimes there's the possibility of integration. And so flourishing includes suffering. And there's, I think, a lot of fruitful conversation about flourishing as wholeness amidst adversity. There's a wonderful book called Mathematics for Human Flourishing that makes that point. Flourishing is really about how do we respond well in ways that bring greater wholeness to ourselves and to others, despite the difficult circumstances we find ourselves in. So I'll leave it at that and offer space for David.
Well, that's great, Matt. And there's multiple things we want to double click on there. Before we do that, I want to go over to David, but I also want to mention, you brought up, I think, 3 different points there that kind of speak to what we mentioned earlier, which is Paul Bloom's new book, The Sweet Spot. And I mentioned we're having Todd Kashdan on the show quite soon. And of course, what are they both really experts in many ways is sort of the, as Todd would say, the upside of the dark side, right? The role of unpleasantness, psychological range, living a whole life, and its impact on well-being. I just want to highlight that point because I think it's easy to misunderstand flourishing with the constant presence of pleasantness. right? And we're actually finding more and more that that's actually quite harmful. It also calls to mind Dopamine Nation, Anna Lemke's new book, and so I at least wanted to highlight that. But David, let's pop over to you. How would you define human flourishing? Similar to Matt and Harvard? Any distinctions?
No, I mean, I would absolutely agree, and I think Matt has said it so well. And there's so many things that he said that absolutely touch me to the core. I think it's very, very well put. I'm no philosopher, but in a sort of philosophical sense, for me, I sort of think of flourishing as a journey, which starts from where we are. So the question of being, the kind of notion of becoming, and finally one of transforming. But in that, flourishing really is a sort of contentedness with being, a contentedness with who we are. Now, this is not in a sense a liberal way, in a liberal sense that you take everything that is thrown at you, but it's a critical contentedness, an ability to see the world in a way that we understand our collective lots, whether it's poverty or hunger or famine or the kinds of adversities that we experience globally. And as I said, it's not a contentedness in terms of accepting the condition, but a contentedness in understanding where we are and why things are as they are. And then a sort of soberness in becoming. So rather than lofty, unachievable ideals, a real soberness in thinking about the pathways that are possible out of adversity or out of uncertainty, to move away from our lots and to become something else, but absolutely driven by a soberness and an objectivity in all of that. And finally, I suppose really it is about a sort of facilitativeness or a collaborativeness in transforming. So ultimately, flourishing is about transforming, but that this transformation is not an individual transformation. It's not an individual sort of superhuman goal to change the world on your own, but really to work with others in a collaborative way, to facilitate the desires and wants of others is very much an important part of flourishing. To stand back and watch other people thrive, to stand back and watch collectives move from one space to another space, to stand back and see poverty shrink and prosperity grow is a facilitative process. So that's how I would, in a sense, sum up flourishing as a kind of, journey with a number of steps laid out, that being, becoming, and transforming, and in that, our particular roles as contentedness, perhaps soberness, and collaborativeness in transformation.
It's incredibly interesting to me, and I think, again, worth highlighting. You both have raised, I think, a fair and legitimate criticism, maybe unintentionally, but nonetheless sort of a criticism of a field that I think we are all fans of and think there is a place for, and that is positive psychology. But positive psychology has really kind of blown up in popularity, I'd say, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. And what I hear is sort of the evolution as a consequence of the criticism of pos psych, which is it's not just about the individual. It's not just about positive thinking. It's not just about kind of accepting your lot and thinking better about it, right? And it's more nuanced than that. And so while there's a place for the field, obviously, and it's brought tremendous things, I love that we are already starting out looking at the idea of flourishing a bit more holistically than it is sometimes represented. So thank you both for those really nuanced responses. John, you want to move us back, I think, over to Matt's comments about the different domains of flourishing.
Yeah, well, thank you both for these fantastically lucid and eloquent answers. There's so much we could ask you about here, and so many things I do want to ask you about. Perhaps we could start with, Matt, you mentioned the domains of well-being, domains of flourishing that are important, and this connects with, well, at least one of those connects with the points that Nick was making about positivity in the connection, in the sense that there's the domain of happiness and life satisfaction in the Human Flourishing Programs model, and also perhaps some of the points that David was making about contentment, that relating perhaps to life satisfaction, but not being directly the same as that. So I think it'd be important to just clarify to begin with, to get clear on these definitions of flourishing, what those domains are of flourishing that the Human Flourishing Program focus on.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just say at the outset that there are a number of frameworks for conceptualizing and then measuring flourishing, and they all offer something of value. And so there's a lot of overlap, but there's some distinctiveness across these various frameworks. The blue zones framework with, sort of pyramid of, at the base is belonging, and then you move up, to other elements. And so, that's a popular one that's being adopted by some healthcare systems. But our framework at the Human Flourishing Program really derives from the early conceptual work of our program director, Tyler Vanderweel, and then some of the subsequent empirical testing. And we find that, people really do place importance on these domains, and it includes happiness and life satisfaction. So it would be nice to feel good and have positive affect and look back on your life and say it was, a satisfying, life, but also mental and physical health. And that's where some of the psychological focus misses out on physical health. But people want their bodies to be vital and, to feel energized and to feel healthy and to be free of impairment. And, then meaning and purpose are really important, and those have often been focused on, but what's been less focused on is character and virtue. And so are we becoming better people? And, I've had so many conversations over the years about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and self-actualization. I keep pointing out that, self-actualization is great, but self-transcendence is really what he was talking about at the end of his life. And so losing ourselves in the service of a noble cause that benefits others is really important to our growth as individuals. And there's a whole new, field emerging, interdisciplinary field called life improvement science. There was the first conference this year about how do we become well so we can do well. And, I really think that that's where, Tyler's approach, reading more philosophy and theology, thinking about character and virtue and bringing that into the framework was really so helpful. And then, of course, without close social relationships, nothing happens. And so that's another important thing. We are fundamentally social beings, and we must relate. And so if you look at these domains, this is sort of a baseline. Almost everyone can agree. Yes, it would be better to have a satisfying social relationship than an unsatisfying one. It would be better to grow in goodness than to become, less good. And so when we think about something like religion or spirituality, which for many people would be an outcome, a domain of flourishing that they would want to cultivate, we can also note that religion and spirituality contribute to a sense of meaning and purpose. It contributes to a sense of character and virtue. So we sometimes think about pathways to flourishing, and each of these domains may be affected by our family experiences, our religious communities, our workplaces, our educational settings. But spirituality can be an important outcome, an important domain of flourishing itself. So it's both a pathway and an outcome. And just as social relationships can help us achieve a greater sense of meaning and purpose, greater sense of happiness, et cetera. So a lot of these domains can also be pathways. And so we're really trying to understand the relationships among the domains, and then which domains seem to cause the other ones. And so if we wanted to do an intervention, where might we focus? Where would we put our emphasis if we wanted the most return on investment, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much for that, Matt, for clarifying those domains. And David, some of those connect with some of the points you were mentioning that I'd love to focus on. So you really focused on this idea of flourishing not being so much a state we're in, but a journey towards somewhere we're going. And that connects with some of the points it seemed that Matt was saying then as well, that as you said, David, flourishing is a process of becoming. It's a journey, process of being, becoming, transforming. And toward one of the dimensions we're moving towards is contentment, which is perhaps connected with the sense of life satisfaction, one domain in the Harvard model. You mean contentment, soberness, and collaboration being key points where we're perhaps aiming. So maybe you could just clarify that a bit more, David. What the process? What's the journey kind of moving towards on this flourishing journey, which itself can be one of human flourishing, but perhaps then reaches a peak, which we could maybe use notions such as self-actualization from Maslow to help clarify what that might have evolved and so on. But how do you see this process of becoming towards something else?
Fantastic, John. My opening remarks is I'm not a philosopher. So perhaps I should say in my second bite of the cherry, I'm not great at, I'm not a great sort of semiotic linguist, but I was really looking at your hands and as you were trying to illustrate your point, and it kind of struck me that when we talk of flourishing, and almost in the way that you were illustrating, we see it perhaps as growth and growth towards, but that growing towards as an upward trajectory. And so, the shape that your hands are taking and so on. And I can see that. And so many of these models, psychological models take, Kohlberg's stages of moral development. There's the idea that we grow towards, we become more expansive in our understanding about life. And it's just kind of struck me. I wonder whether it is actually a contention between growth and depth. And is it possible to see flourishing not as growing towards something upwards, but actually growing deeper, so that you're not sort of moving from, point A to point B on a journey that is an upward trajectory, but moving from point A to point B almost downwards, a deeper. So, you mentioned the term sort of religion. So, can we become more deeply religious? Can we become more deeply contented? So the idea that we're not necessarily shifting. So in economic terms, prosperity would be an outcome, which would probably mean that, if you were looking at your bank balance, it was X on one day and Y another day, with Y being, larger than X. So a sense of growth or health well-being, that you actually get visibly better, you kind of live better, and so on. There's nothing wrong with these ideas, but I also think a case could be made for flourishing as depth, and that flourishing is about becoming more content with ourselves, a much deeper spiritual understanding of contentness, of who we are, the ability to reflect deeply, rather than a kind of physical shift. Does that help?
I would love to jump in on that.
Please.
That's really an important point, and I'm thinking, back to what Nick was saying about some of the criticism of positive psychology. I don't know that individual positive psychologists were not interested or focused on suffering, but it seemed like the way positive psychology was being used by organizations that want more productivity out of workers, or schools that want better grade point averages or something. It seemed like somewhere along the way, suffering got lost in the conversation. And David, what you're suggesting reminds me of something that the psychologist Paul Wong said in a recent talk to our program, that in order for the tree to grow very tall, it has to sink the roots deep into the soil. So sinking the roots into the soil is touching suffering. And so for Paul, you flourish more if you're actually awake and aware to suffering, and you can work with that, creatively. And so a lot of what he's been doing in his work is to help people he talks about mature happiness, finding a balance, by integrating suffering and responding to it creatively. So when we think about our own psychological well-being, we might have very unhealthy ways of coping with our suffering. And then we say we're happy, we're using substances to get a rush or something, to get some escape from our suffering. And that's not really flourishing, but we might report that we're relatively happy because we're living in this kind of hedonistic mode. But even going back to Maslow, he talks about the merely healthy self-actualizers, and then he talks about the ones who are really doing transformative work, who had become, in his words, a good member of the human species. And these were folks who, again, in his words, may have experienced a kind of cosmic sadness. They look around at their level of awareness and they see a lot of problems that would be easily preventable. But many people are kind of caught up in a selfish kind of awareness. So flourishing is connected to our stage of development in terms of our awareness. Are we focused mostly on our own needs or the needs of the near and dear? Or are we able to see how we are connected with everyone, and therefore their flourishing and well-being is important directly to our flourishing and well-being? So that sense of interconnection, I think, is fostered by being able to connect with our own suffering. And so if we're pushing suffering away and we're not sending the roots deep into the soil, then our how we will understand flourishing is going to be impoverished.
There's so much to connect here. There's so much wonderful, I think, synthesis to be had. I first want to mention, Matt, you might not even remember this, but in a previous conversation you and I had, we talked about soil. And you very cleverly reminded me that the healthiest soil is usually filled with manure. Right? It's not all good. Some of it stinks. Intended, right?
Well, and the other great way to look at it, we have a community of practice that we run through the program, and one of our members is from Japan, and she said, here's a picture of a tray I prepared for a traditional tea ceremony, and you take the bitter taste before you take the sweet taste. And then the sweet taste is all the sweeter because you've integrated the bitter. So life involves death and suffering and loss and grief and all of these things. But if we get caught just in the bitter taste and we don't go through the whole ceremony, we might not flourish. But if we can find a way to bring all of these flavors together, we can live what she so beautifully called a delicious life. And that's flourishing. The integration of the I think what David was saying was really important. It's not just accepting to the point of being complacent. It's you accept life on life's terms, but then you can work creatively with it and even joyfully. And I've known people in the midst of great conflicts or trying to transform systemic injustices where there's a lot of stagnant. You can't make progress in the short run, but they continue to do it for decades and they don't lose hope. And they've somehow figured out, how do I accept that this is true, but there's something that I can do creatively with it. And so you're not pushing it away. You're not trying to run from it. And so I think that some of the positive psychology has focused on how do people gain a broader perspective on their own lives, on their role within a larger narrative, a larger story, so that they can see their contribution to creating something like beloved community, something that really benefits everyone. But they know that they're suffering all along the way, and they're able to accept that in the short run, they may not realize all of their goals. But as Martin Luther King put it, in the long run, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice.
So it's interesting the way a lot of these topics are weaving together. And if we just sort of kind of take a tangent from the suffering piece just for a second and go back to, David, I like the way you put it, watching John's hands, these notions of peak experiences, which are often associated with flourishing. So as you two are walking us through this, I leaned over to my other laptop and pulled up Transcend by Scott Barry Kaufman. I said, okay, Maslow, according to Scott, right, he never actually had a hierarchy of needs, and that self-actualization is really about, as Scott argues, transcendence, right? And in the last chapter, he draws parallels to sort of this burgeoning field of neurotheology, right? Andrew Newberg. And I want to read a quote to you that I pulled up here that Scott argues, and this field, neurotheology, argues that peak experiences are actually defined as transcendent experiences, transient mental states marked by decreased self-salience and increased feelings of connectedness, right? It's really more about the we than the me when we talk about self-actualization and sort of those higher levels of maybe consciousness, you might argue. So I just wanted to bring all that together. There was so much really wonderful synergy there.
Yeah. No, I agree entirely. I think certainly, I'm a psychologist for better or for worse. And in my early undergraduate sort of studies, on the usual sort of diet of Freud and later Piaget, and the sense of, a variety of positive psychologists who weren't called positive psychology, at the time. But I think there was really an important book that influenced me really quite a lot. So it's an old text written by Viktor Frankl, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's set in the context of sufferings amongst Jewish people in that sort of brutality and violence of persecution, and also because I sort of had a more than just one political bone in my body, and I couldn't quite relate things like human suffering or the human condition or things that challenge us to individual challenges, but to collective challenges. I started looking at completely opposite frames of reference to understand human nature, human thinking, what drives us, what allows us to be, and actually settled on some texts by Russian philosophers and Russian scholars. And there was, for example, Vishiluk, who spoke of experience. And it's wonderful in the way that that text is written, that it actually invokes Shakespeare's Macbeth, and says, do you understand that your entire family has been wiped out? What are you going to do about it, sort of physically, in activity? He says, well, I understand that. Do you mean my children as well? Yeah, absolutely, everyone in the family. What are you going to do about it? You've got to do something. You've got to deal with this as a man. And the reply was, yes, I will deal with this as a man, but first I have to experience it as a man. And when Vishiluk then wrote on emotion and the sense of experience, that was really for me incredibly striking. And I think I think where Matt was going on this point, it is about being able to appreciate and experience not only individual suffering, but collective suffering. Why is it that groups of people, whether they be of a particular racial group, a particular persecuted religious group, etc., of which you might be part, and of course of which you may not be part, but have an enormous empathy for the collective suffering of others, away from one's own pain, to being able to experience and empathize with the pain and suffering of others. And I think it's when that opens up that for me becomes really an important part of flourishing, the depth of understanding, the ability for collective, for social empathy, even where that empathy is very, very far away from, where you live and your own individual vision.
It's interesting you bring up Frankl. This is actually a second conversation in a row in which Man's Search for Meaning has come up.
Right.
I have a feeling it's going to continue to come up in some of these conversations. I want to throw it over to John in just a minute to take us in a different direction. But before we do that, I'd love to just sort of summarize these domains we're talking about and kind of concretize them for our listeners. So just sort of in review, we're kind of covering 6 different domains for human flourishing, right? Happiness and satisfaction. There's different types of happiness, right? There's hedonism, or sort of just pleasure, positive emotion, if you will, pleasantness more generally, right? Eudaimonic well-being, sort of virtue, personal growth, meaning-based well-being, and then life satisfaction, which is a bit more kind of holistic, retrospective in many cases, right? You've got mental and physical well-being, and Matt, you really hammered home the piece about the physical well-being. We're talking sleep, movement, nutrition, hydration, just sort of the core things, right? Meaning and purpose, kind of this connection to larger communities, to the we, not just the me, right? And how can we positively impact that through our actions? Social connection, I think we mostly agree, like social connection, quality relationships, one of the single greatest predictors of happiness, globally speaking, right? Character and virtue, something you said, Matt, is typically sort of underemphasized, but sort of being the quality of human being that we hope to be and growing in those ways, right? What we bring to the world. And then the last one, I don't know, we talked about too much, but I believe it's essentially material well-being or material stability and sort of core needs, correct? That, money may not buy happiness, but it's a little harder to be there when we're in poverty, for instance, right? Like being able to secure core needs, food, water, shelter, healthcare, things of that nature. Does that just about sum it up?
Well, the last, yes, there's also kind of flourishing at the community level, so we could talk about that. But The last point about financial material stability is an interesting one. I think it is true that, we, in order to survive, we need shelter and food and things like that. So you do need a certain level of material stability, but that will vary quite a bit. And in fact, in a lot of our survey research around the world, we find that in countries where there's a lot of financial precarity and a lot of self-reported concern about financial material stability, that there's very high levels of the other domains. And in the United States, where there's higher levels of financial material stability, the average scores on these other domains are quite a bit lower. So I think it's an open question about the dose there.
Yeah.
How much, do you need? Because we know people take the vow of poverty and lead quite meaningful, fulfilling lives of great character and virtue. And so, what is it that we actually need? And I'm remembering an article in the magazine, The Atlantic, written by one of our program affiliates, Arthur Brooks, where he talks about how quality of life has been going up for years and years, but our sense of being well or happiness has been going down.
Right.
So our objective conditions are improving, but our experience is perhaps declining. And he ends by saying, don't trade love for anything. And so if we're putting so much emphasis on the financial and material, that we're de-emphasizing close social relationships or character and virtue, then we're probably aiming at the wrong target. So I would say that the other domains are ends in themselves. The financial material stability could be a means to an end, but we wouldn't want to turn that into an end. So if it enables us to do more good in the world, then it facilitates flourishing. But if it becomes our focus, and societally, it seems to be more of a focus in the United States than some of the other countries we've studied, and that is contributing to lower overall flourishing and lower scores on a number of domains, including ones that we wouldn't, quite expect. So there's a really rich conversation about the relationship between these ends and the various means that we use to achieve
I'm
that.
really, really glad you brought that up. I think the language was perfect, the distinction between sort of means and ends and which one we're focusing on. And you mentioned the research sort of showing, materialistic tendencies and points of focus actually on ill-being. And it also reminds me of Civilized to Death, Christopher Ryan. Right? He essentially argues that like hunter-gatherer tribes tend to be happier and that civilization is actually in some ways making us less happy despite these creature comforts. It made me chuckle when I heard about it the first time. He kind of said, the most that they might work in a given week, these hunter-gatherer tribes, is say 14 to 20 hours. And what are they doing? They're hunting, fishing, and gardening, the things we do for vacation and leisure. Right?
Right. Well, and there's a sense in, for most of human history, we lived in small tribes and we all needed each other. Like if I didn't do my part, the whole group might suffer. And so
Right.
I need you and you need me. And now in these, very large industrialized societies, it's not clear that I'm needed. I might actually be superfluous. And that sense that we don't really matter is a source of great despair. So we have a kind of high standard of living that produces a lot of materialistic forms of happiness, but we might feel, somewhat disconnected or alienated inside. So that seems to be one of we don't have definitive data at this point, but that seems to be one plausible explanation for why we find flourishing so much higher in these settings that are just objectively more financially distressed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think there are a number of pieces there that swirl around a lot, and they sort of worth investigating a bit further. So from a cross-cultural perspective, which and at a societal level, I think arguments could be made in terms of sort of Western social democracies, like the Scandinavian countries, etc. The idea is that a society takes the burden of prosperity. So it's not down to an individual to make money to achieve a particular end in itself. Look at my bank balance. The idea is that society blunts that by saying everyone should have enough as to fulfill their basic needs. But that is not an individual problem. It is a collective societal problem that is driven from the top. So social welfare becomes meaningful rather than something that is despised because it's understood as such. And of course, there are, but not all societies have reached, in a sense, collectively that level of prosperity and wealth, so that distribution is indeed, possible. It then comes down to groups to accept their lots, and that poverty becomes, in a sense, part of the equation. So Bhutan, a country I'm very fond of and have done quite a bit of work there, has got, in objection to the economic measure of gross of GDP, a sort of gross national happiness, in a sense, not suggesting that they have in fact been able to achieve it, and there's more to the concept than a sort of fluffy use of words. But these things do sort of, I think, need a lot of probing, which I know is probably one of the questions that you will or intend to invite us to speak to, about the sort of, is flourishing understood the same across different cultural contexts? And if we're talking about material well-being, and if we're talking about means to or end or outcomes themselves, and this question becomes frightfully important. Who drives and whose responsibility is it?
Well, that's precisely the question we'd actually like to ask you both now. In fact, because you've both mentioned there, you've both done extensive research on flourishing globally, and the points you've made there bring up various interesting connections that we'd like to go further on. So, David, through your work on learning and education in relation to flourishing in many nations worldwide, particularly various African nations. And Matt, through your work on the new Global Flourishing Study, the largest worldwide initiative to date investigating the factors that influence flourishing. So you've mentioned some of this already. We'd like to go in deeper on this. Could you each tell us about your research on flourishing worldwide and some key observations you've made about the similarities and differences in the ways that people flourish across the nations and cultures where you've done empirical research? One you've just mentioned there, David, Bhutan. And one question I'd be particularly interested to hear your views on is the one David's mentioned there, whether the domains vary across cultures and nations, actually a whole other domain perhaps of well-being, or whether the importance of some of those domains that we've discussed so far, such as happiness and life satisfaction, financial and material stability, meaning and purpose, whether those vary in terms of the importance things. So let's go to you first on this, Matt, and it'd be also great if you could say a little bit about the Global Flourishing Study, this new initiative that you're involved with.
Sure, thank you. So there's so much, that's another hour-long conversation in and of itself. So I'll offer just a few remarks. The Global Flourishing Study is a joint venture between our program and the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University in collaboration with Gallup. And so Gallup has just abundant experience collecting data around the world and trying to figure out, what do these survey items that we write in English mean in other languages as they understood through other cultural lenses, and how is it possible to even compare these results? And so we've done some work up to this point with worker samples around the world, mostly factory workers around the world. And so what the Global Flourishing Study will allow us to do is to collect community-based samples. Workers tend to do better than the general population. They're earning income and, for a variety of reasons, they're healthy enough to go to work. And so they don't have some of the debilitating problems to the same degree as the general community. So we want to understand not just workers, but at some point, are we going to be able to generalize to the human species if we do this well? And so by collecting data from 22 different countries, every year, a nationally representative sample in each of these countries, and then following the same people for 5 years so we can see how things change within the same individuals, we will have more ability to really understand what's going on. Now, there are more ways to study people than survey research. So I'm not suggesting that this will give us the definitive answer to which countries are the most flourishing or something like that. But it does help us to understand something about how people in different countries understand flourishing, and then some of the variables that relate to flourishing. So what we've noticed, though, with our worker samples, getting back to what I was alluding to earlier, that it might be that sense of meaning and purpose within warm social relationships is really, really important. And that explains some of the differences. Why do we find, I'll just take an example within the United States. The worst self-reported physical health is with medical students and medical residents of any of the samples that we've collected, which is, kind of a sad irony, because these are folks who are being trained to care for the health and well-being of patients, and their emotional health is really quite low as well. But it's interesting to me that we have a project right now looking at residents of senior living centers. They've retired. The average age is over 80 years old. Most of them are dealing with multiple physical health problems. And yet self-reported physical health scores are so much higher than medical residents, for example. And so, why is that? Well, I think there's a certain kind of load that the human body and the human emotions, the brain, and can withstand that is being pushed beyond the limits for medical students and medical residents. And this retired group, even though objectively they suffer from more physical health conditions, they feel like they're relatively physically healthy. And so when we look around the world at groups that have very high levels of self-reported flourishing across these domains of happiness and health and meaning and character and social relationships, but relatively low levels of financial and material stability, it seems like they're managing the human condition better than many of us in the United States, where we're so focused on the financial aspects of our lives that might be neglecting our growth as people or our ability to relate to others. And I wonder if the medical residents in this one published study hold some clues, because half of them were exhausted. They reported being exhausted. And of course, if you're working late shifts and trying to learn all sorts of content and then being put in situations where you don't really know what you're doing, but you're responsible for someone's life, that's very stressful. And how much stress can we manage? And in what context do human beings manage stress much better? And that's where, I write a lot in psychology journals, but I'm actually a sociologist. And so I go back to the container. What kind of container, social container, have we built? What are the conditions of the soil that enable individuals to deal with their stressors through relying on their warm social relationships? So we may have a lot of money and we may have gotten a big pay raise, but if we feel disconnected from other people, and if we feel like we're not part of warm social relationships, then the money is not really going to be all that beneficial if we are exhausted and we can't rely on a supportive, nurturing container. Matt, so I think those are the clues that we're picking up in this preliminary work. I don't want to draw too firm a conclusion from it, but I think the Global Flourishing study will help us really get a more representative understanding of what people are experiencing around the world.
Matt, will you just clarify for the listeners? I think you're using warm social relationships very intentionally there. What you mean by warm as opposed to cold relationships?
I really like Martin Buber's distinction between what he calls I and it relationships, where you're treating the other person as a means to an end, versus an I and you or I and thou. Sometimes the translation's different, but I'm a fully realized human being and you're a fully realized human being, and we're not using each other instrumentally. I think that's where the warmth is experienced, where we have value, we have inherent dignity. We might say infinite value, and the people we're relating to have infinite value. And so we're not going to just use them to foster our own agendas, but we're going to relate to them as though they were sacred as we are. So they're not objects, they're people. And I think that way of relating, Buber makes a distinction between experience and encounter. And experience is sort of, you analyze it, sort of intellectual or whatever. You have these things that you're extracting from the world to have these experiences. Whereas an encounter, time sort of stops and you start to participate in a real relationship. You start to really see the person in their fullness. And this is why many philosophers and even psychologists have said, the other person doesn't fully appear to you unless you love them. If you don't love them, you're missing out on important information about their full being, their totality, their wholeness. And it's only through love that you can appreciate that. And that's where the warmth, I think, is evident. When people are engaged in warm relationships, there's a kind of relaxation that is often experienced. I mean, sometimes love is, sucking in other things too, but oftentimes you have the sense that I'm safe and you're safe, and we can relax into that safe space. We can really see each other. And when that warmth is absent, the trust is absent. And so I'm suspicious and I'm not sure what your motives are. And you don't know what I'm up to. And so, I think that that's one of the lessons that we're going to see more clearly through the Global Flourishing study. We're getting glimpses of it already.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Same question to you, David. So in your work worldwide, in the various nations you've worked with. What do you see as being, what are some of the main similarities and differences you observed in the way people flourish across the nations and cultures where you've done empirical research?
This is an enormously difficult question, and I'll try something. I've just kind of been scribbling as we've speaking. But if you actually draw, on a page, a cross really is the best way to explain it. A vertical line and horizontal line that gives you sort of four quadrants, and the vertical line, the kind of y-axis on the top is sort of a construct such as meaning seeking, and the bottom of that line being sort of prosperity seeking, or wealth seeking, well-being seeking, and then the horizontal line on the left, you might have sort of collective, and on the right, individual. So in these four quadrants, can we just as a very rough and unscientific exercise sort of profile almost cultures and nations without, as I said, it's not a kind of scientific finding, but if you looked at the quadrant on the sort of top far right as meaning seeking and individual, the question perhaps is who am I? How do I stand? How do I understand myself as an individual? And that becomes a big driver for how people perceive flourishing, and what they, in a sense, are inclined to sort of do about it. So there are similarities, but also deep differences between, say, the UK and the US, who might both be in that sort of quadrant. Similarities and differences very interesting. So, I'm on a committee in Oxford that is looking to appoint a new vice chancellor. We look at what we pay our vice chancellors, and our recruiting teams are looking at stealing Harvard's president away from himself, or some, an Australian sort of leader of a university. And the big question for this committee is, will these people come for what we're able to pay them? And the answer to that is absolutely not. And we ask questions about retention and recruitment for academic staff, and people who we approach from the US look at what we offer in salaries and laugh us out of court. Say, what is that what you're offering? So the question, why would you work in Oxford? Why would you work in a university in the UK? It's clearly not for the money. So certainly for academics, both in the US and the UK, there are huge differences in what they might consider to be, if you want to look at your sort of trajectory in the way that it might be upwards, saying, well, my bank balance is going nowhere if I move to the UK, But the alternative question is, how satisfying would a job at Oxford as opposed to Harvard be? And would that be a reason why I would drag my family across the Atlantic to settle in a different country? But so this quadrant of is interesting, in that meaning seeking could be a very individualistic meaning seeking. There's nothing wrong with that, and I'm not saying that people are labeled by that any individual has that label attributed to their entire being. But it is an interesting, when one speaks to people and tries to understand what drives them, then this is quite evident in some countries. They come down clockwise to the sort of wealth seeking, wealth driving individual, whatever done. But if you look at that at the national level, what do we do in a society to make the society prosperous? If one looks at South Korea, it basically went from educational attainment of pretty low levels, so basically school completion, right? What levels of schooling do people complete? What levels of university? To an absolutely phenomenal educational attainment that a vast number of its population are now university educated, etc. Along with that has come enormous growth and prosperity in wealth. So if you look at an international, sort of financial table of wealth, and South Korea is well up there, leading a lot of economists to say, well, this is exactly what you do to drive national prosperity, is to ensure that people have, attain higher and higher in school, that everyone is a university graduate, etc. And if we come further down that quadrant to more sort of, well-being, but collective, one might look at things, in African countries, Ubuntu in South Africa. It's very much a kind of collective perspective about how do we, as a nation, our understanding of ourselves is a national understanding, and how do we, together as a nation, and they use these interesting metaphors like march together or march together hand in hand or whatever, hug each other and have these wonderful warm huddles. How do we work together as a nation to achieve this, whether it is well-being or wealth and prosperity, and so on. And then the final piece. I mean, I'd love to put China in that very first quadrant, which is about meaning making as a collective. And China, and this can sort of work both ways. But China, in my view, has become ultimately very, very nationally driven. Almost nationally. So under Xi Jinping, it's about we have to be understood as a nation. People need to understand who China is and what we what we can do, and that is at the top of the agenda. So being Chinese, being a member of that society, is the ultimate flourishing. It's about national identity. It's about secureness in who we are. And comparatively, we don't necessarily have that in the US or in the UK. People don't go around flushing their British passports or waving American flags, or perhaps they do, but particularly at sports events. But but that's the point. So the kind of cross-cultural stuff is. And cross-national stuff is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's these, perhaps unscientific constructs and ways of trying to understand different societies and different nations does give us, I think, a very interesting perspective on what flourishing means across different borders.
There's a lot of personal resonance for me in particular there, David. First of all, I love the idea of these 4 quadrants. I was kind of drawing it out as you were walking through it. Matt, it looked like you were too, as we were going through it. So, I mean, just for context, my wife is Vietnamese American. She's the daughter of 2 Vietnamese refugees from what, the Vietnamese refer to as the American War, of course. And it, like I said, personal resonance. Like I can see culturally with her and her family sharp differences from somebody who's born and raised in the States and spent most of his time in the Western world. So thank you for bringing up the point and clearly articulating that. That's hugely valuable.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly that a colleague and I wrote a paper where we developed a new measure of inner peace, and we said that peace and harmony don't seem to be really strong components of conversations about flourishing and thriving and complete well-being. And so we thought it would be helpful to have a measure and to put some light on that. But really, if you look around the world, there's often this distinction. People say, well, it's more of a focus in the East than in the West, peace and harmony. But if you look around the world, and you give people the opportunity to define happiness, even in Western countries, people talk about harmony. And, we want to be at peace with ourselves, not constantly at war with ourselves. And we don't actually want to be at war with other people. So we want inner and outer harmony as important aspects of flourishing. And, we can think about one of the themes that we've touched on in various ways in this conversation. I think David started off with, flourishing doesn't always have to be about growth. It can be about depth. And I think that's where harmony and peace give us additional purchase on that idea. If we create societies that are economic growth machines, because we have created societies that are economic growth machines, we create a lot of conflict around the world and put a lot of strain on the natural environment. And so we're at a point now where we have no choice but to reimagine flourishing as deeply connected, inseparable from harmony, both the inner experience of peace and harmony, but also harmonious relationships with other people across cultures and with the natural environment. And I really think that that's going to be the next big focus within this research, which has moved away from very narrow understandings of wellness to a broader understanding of well-being, and now flourishing, which would include the spiritual domains as well as this notion of relationship and responsibility to other people and to the natural world. So I think the convergent thinking that I witness around the world when I'm part of these conversations is all pointing to that level of integration.
Great. Thank you both so much for your fascinating contributions on this question. It's been amazing to learn from you in everything you've said so far, but in particular in response to this question, this has been incredible. I've got two questions I'm going to try and mold into one because they're both very practically focused. And so in your answer to the next question, consider this, I'll phrase these as two connected questions, and please see if you can find a way to connect your answer into kind of a holistic response to both of them. So Matt, earlier on, you mentioned pathways to flourishing in your discussion of what flourishing consists in. Pathways being areas of life that significantly enhance the areas of well-being, or those domains of well-being that most contribute towards living a good life. And we know that the Flourishing program at Harvard have identified 4 of those: education, work, family, and religious community. And David, in your work too, you focus on pathways to flourishing worldwide in various global contexts in the empirical studies you've done, the research you're currently doing. So what do you each think the pathways to flourishing are? And are there any others that research is yet to show are pathways that hasn't yet shown are pathways that it might do in the future? And connected with that is what Nick and I call the fucking question that we ask all of our guests at the end of interviews, which is, what's the one lesson on human flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with? And what might be a practical step for putting that lesson into action? So perhaps that could be connected up with the pathways to flourishing. So Matt, if you want to take them on first.
Tell people how to flourish. It's that simple, right? Just,
just phrased it like that.
So yeah, I think the most important question here is, how do we spend our time? And as children, we spend our time in families and schools. And as adults, we spend our time in families and workplaces and, in religious communities. And so that's why we focused on these pathways where people spend their time. And so if we look at the workplace is, as our colleagues in public health, Eileen McNeely and others at the SHINE program, are constantly reminding us, the workplace is a wonderful platform for flourishing, but we don't see it that way. So they're trying to raise, consciousness and show that if you focus on flourishing, you actually get the organization, whatever it might be doing, whatever its mission is actually more effective at achieving its goals. And if you neglect that, you run into all sorts of inefficiencies. So if we look worldwide, Gallup has been polling workers for years, and what percentage of workers are engaged in the sense of being highly involved in and enthusiastic about and committed to their work and their workplace. And it varies around the world, but for about a decade now, it's been about 12 to 22%. So that's not great. And we spend a lot of time at work. And so what can we do to help people connect in meaningful ways, both to their workplace and to their coworkers and themselves? And same thing in schools. Gallup has found in the United States what they call the school cliff, where engagement falls as children work their way through school. So you start out in elementary school with fairly high levels of engagement. 8 out of 10 students are engaged. By middle school, it's 6 out of 10. By high school, it's 4 out of 10. And who's at the lowest level? Teachers. So it keeps going through college and then into the workplace. And so there's just an enormous opportunity for us to get really curious about why that's the case. What's going on here? Have we removed play and joy from the kids' experience, and then teachers have no play or joy at all? Have we disconnected human beings from the creative arts, which is actually an important biological need that we have to meet? And over time, we're doing less and less of that. And by the time you're a teacher, you don't have any time at all for that. So when we start to think about, pathways, and then like, what's the big question or what's the big opportunity here? How do we spend our time? And let's focus on flourishing in those contexts. If we're working 8 to 10 hours a day, then we have no choice but to focus on the workplace. And if kids are spending all of this time in school, then why don't we get curious not only about their academic test scores and abilities, but about how they're relating to themselves and to other people, and how they're seeing themselves as part of a broader story that's meaningful to them, where they can say, the point of life is not just to get a good degree so I can get into a good college so I can make money and then die, but there's something else to life beyond that kind of cycle. And what we've been telling young people and even workers as they go through their careers is that really is the purpose of life. Just get these credentials, make money, and then hopefully your kids can get into a good school and repeat the cycle all over again. There's more to life than that, and we can help people connect with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And David, same question to you. The pathways to flourishing. What do you see them as being? And what's the kind of one lesson you'd like listeners to take away today as a kind of a way towards flourishing?
Thanks, John. I'm inclined really to agree. I'd like just to maybe take further, Matt's points about, work, family, schools, and I would see these rather than necessarily pathways, but as settings. And I think Matt said something really right at the very beginning of this conversation, which is something I'm very keen on, which is activity. It's human activity. So human activity, takes place in settings wherever these settings are. But where human activity takes place, it is normally activity that is built around tension and contradiction. So in the workplace, we all know that blue-collared workers putting wheels on Ford cars or whatever, and I think Matt was talking earlier about alienation and so on, all these wonderful sociological concepts that come flooding back. So if you're in a workplace putting tires onto cars coming off a production line, that's not a great sort of setting in which one flourishes. So one doesn't necessarily flourish simply because one is in a setting, but one is able to flourish if the contradictions around work in a workplace are both exposed and mediated. So I'll draw here on the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire. And for Paulo Freire, when he, in his books of the what was it called again? I can't remember the something of the oppressed.
Pedagogy.
That's the pedagogy of oppressed. The idea around conscientization, and where he gets mothers to come along and says, well, I don't want to use the primer. The cat sat on the mat to teach you how to read. But I have here a picture of Brazilian mothers with their hands in soap suds doing the washing up. What does this mean to you? And allow people to talk about their meaningful domestic experiences, and basically use that as a way in which to teach them literacy around meaningful activities. And, there are hundreds of examples of how, labor organizations, trade unionists, blue-collar workers getting together in the workplace to understand their contradictions and to carry out activities that bring meaning to what it is they're doing. And sometimes that meaning-seeking behavior is a challenging behavior, strikes or go slows, etc. But the workplace is the context, and it's those activities that ultimately is a way of collectively finding meaning in what people do. The same in schools. I worked a lot in Pakistan amongst communities whose kids were really picking through the trash every day to sell things, to put on the table so that their families could eat one solid meal in the evening, and sitting down with their fathers and mothers, saying, well, can't you send your kids to school? I said, well, how will we eat? And it's trying to find a way of being able to mediate these really important contradictions to then make schools and make communities in which activity takes place, settings around which meaningful activity can take place. But the idea of mediation and clearly the idea of meaningfulness around those activities, that those activities have a purpose. For me, it's these three things that produce, as it were, the pathways to human flourishing. Settings in which people work or play together, as Matt was saying, the idea of meaning, which could be contradiction and tension, and the idea of mediation. And sometimes this is through education, sometimes this is through, advocates, people wanting to help drive meaning makers. And it's putting together that triangle that constitutes, for me, the pathways towards human flourishing.
Well, I think you both just brought up plenty of good reason for a follow-up episode on the settings and flourishing in these settings. I know John and I are particularly keen to, at some point, dig deep into flourishing in education and sort of what that means for systemic change. I don't think we're alone in that, by the way, by any means.
Yep.
But for now, we want to be respectful of your time. Gentlemen, this was fascinating. Absolutely wonderful. I learned a lot. Really, really beautiful synthesis, I think, through so many of your responses. We really appreciate the time, the nuance, the care, the thoughtfulness that you brought to the dialogue today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for organizing it. And Matt, really lovely to talk together, and an enormous amount indeed, even things I didn't know I knew that came from my own that's great. So
thank you, David. And I would love to see that quadrant published somewhere if you've got something or could put that out. So that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Look forward to. We need another episode on transformative education for flourishing.
Yeah.
So
I'm
on board.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
All the very
Thank
best.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear feedback on that, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.